This video will train on the proper use of the HoverJack, HoverMatt, and HoverTech air supply for vehicle extractions. Before employing the HoverMatt and HoverJack for a vehicle extraction, caregivers should first assess the patient to ensure that they can be removed from the vehicle without additional harm. Caregivers should also assess the vehicle to determine the safest exit for the patient. Starting with valve 1 and working in sequence, inflate the HoverJack to the height of the vehicle seat or just below. Depending on the type of vehicle, this may only be 2 or 3 chambers. Be sure to fully inflate each of the chambers for device stability. A battery-operated power supply is also available for your convenience. Next, place the HoverMatt under the patient using either a sling placement or log roll technique. If log rolling the patient, recline the seat back as far as possible for ease of placement. Ensure that the patient is centered on the HoverMatt with their head approximately 2 inches from the top seam. Buckle the safety straps loosely around the patient. A head-first or foot-first method can be used for patient extraction. Caregivers should review and understand both methods of extraction in order to meet the needs of all patients. With either method, one caregiver should always stay next to the HoverJack to brace it against the vehicle, remaining close to the patient for safety. Never leave the patient unattended on an inflated HoverJack or HoverMatt air transfer system. To extract a patient head first, 2 caregivers are required. For larger patients, a third is recommended. If the seat was reclined to place the HoverMatt, the caregiver closest to the patient should stay next to the patient, while another caregiver moves to the back seat to assist with returning the seat to an upright position. Align the seat approximately 4 inches behind the door frame so the patient's head is positioned to clear the door opening once the HoverMatt is inflated. The caregiver closest to the patient should ensure all HoverMatt transfer handles are visible. Position the inflated HoverJack parallel to the vehicle as close to the patient as possible. For narrow door openings, the tapered head end of the Evacuation HoverJack may allow the device to be placed closer to the vehicle and patient. A slide board or similar device may also be used to bridge any gap. Insert the air supply hose into the nearest hose entry, secure snap, and Velcro. Press the HoverJack button on the air supply to initiate airflow. As soon as the HoverMatt begins to inflate, the caregiver inside the vehicle should move the HoverMatt and patient's head forward and down in order to clear the top of the doorway. Once the head is clear of the doorway, the caregiver outside the vehicle will use the middle and second transfer handles to control and extract the patient's upper body, while the second caregiver ensures the patient's legs clear the door jamb. Ensure the patient is centered on the HoverJack and press the standby button to deflate the HoverMatt. To extract a patient feet first, 3 caregivers are required. 1 caregiver should be in the back seat, a second caregiver should be inside the vehicle opposite the patient, and the third caregiver should remain outside the vehicle next to the inflated HoverJack and patient. Place the HoverMatt beneath the patient and recline both front seats. Position the inflated HoverJack parallel to the vehicle, as close to the patient as possible. Then inflate the HoverMatt. As soon as the HoverMatt begins to inflate, the caregiver in the back seat guides the HoverMatt and patient's upper body to the caregiver in the front seat. The caregiver outside the vehicle grasps the foot end transfer handles to extract the HoverMatt and the patient's lower body, while the caregiver in the front seat guides and protects the patient's head and upper body. Ensure the patient is centered on the HoverJack and press the standby button to deflate the HoverMatt. For backseat extractions, 2 caregivers are required. With the patient lying down, use a log roll technique to place the HoverMatt. Position the inflated HoverJack perpendicular to the vehicle, in line with the patient. Then, inflate the HoverMatt. The caregiver outside the vehicle grasps the foot end transfer handles to extract the HoverMatt and the patient's lower body, while the caregiver on the opposite side guides and protects the patient's head and upper body. Ensure the patient is centered on the HoverJack and press the standby button to deflate the HoverMatt. To extract a patient in the front seat head first out the back door, 3 caregivers are required. If possible, remove the headrest and place the HoverMatt under the patient. If possible, recline both front seats to level out the transfer as much as possible. Once the headrest is removed, the caregiver should support the patient's head until it is on a solid surface. Position the inflated HoverJack perpendicular to the vehicle, in line with the patient. Then, inflate the HoverMatt. As soon as the HoverMatt begins to inflate, the caregiver at the back door next to the HoverJack grasps the handles and supports the head, while the caregiver in the front seat next to the patient guides the foot end to the caregiver on the opposite side of the vehicle. Once the patient starts to turn, the caregiver at the back door pulls them out onto the HoverJack. Ensure the patient is centered on the HoverJack and press the standby button to deflate the HoverMatt. The HoverJack must be at or below seat height for patient extractions. If the HoverJack is below seat height, a transfer medium must be used to bridge the gap. Place the slide board or similar product underneath the patient and HoverMatt and extract the patient using the head or foot end methods previously described. If using the head end method, the caregiver inside the vehicle should lift and guide the patient's legs and feet out of the footwell. Refer to the HoverMatt and HoverJack manuals for additional product information.